You're listening to All In. This is the podcast dedicated to helping you fulfill the mission of God in your life and around the world. I'm your host, Jeff Wilker. Hey everybody, welcome to this week's episode of All In. This week I've got a special treat for you. I've got on the Skype line with me Sam Johnson. Sam is a foursquare overseer for our global outreach to a region called MENICA. MENICA stands for Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia. It's a huge swath of land that is principally occupied by people of the Muslim faith. And so we're going to get into the podcast today on exploring how do we reach people from a Muslim background, how do we understand that part of the world, and how do we faithfully demonstrate the love and compassion of Jesus Christ and proclaim the gospel in such a way that it is fruitful in this place that in many parts of his region used to be Christian. You know, Syria, Africa, Northern Africa, parts of the Middle East were all strong Christian communities at one point, and then they eventually gave way to Islam. And so we're going to explore all of this and get to know some ways that we can reach out to people of the Muslim faith. Sam, welcome to today's podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Great to be with you.
It's always a joy to talk with you and spend time together with you. Hey, couple of things before we dive in. I realize that we're going to be addressing some delicate issues about this part of the world. It can be at times dangerous, and so we have some security items that we'll need to make sure that we are aware of, and so we won't be able to give your contact information out to people and things like that, just to keep our listeners up to speed on if they're wondering, hey, how do I get a hold of Sam? Well, you can't. We keep his identity protected as best as we can, just for his own security and that of his family. But Sam, tell us about what you're doing and what is your life about?
Yeah, we're involved in several things. Planning churches in that region that Jeff just mentioned, MENICA, across the Middle East, North Africa, Central Asia, working both with national leaders in many of those countries, as well as personnel from the U.S. We have people actually from Brazil in that region as well. We're also trying to recruit some more people from Central and South America, because we believe they can be real key to reaching that area of the world. So it's just encouraging, working with, guiding, coming alongside those people who are in the field and sharing their lives and reaching out to the people in that region of the world.
How many foursquare churches are in that part of the world?
Yeah, I don't have the exact figure off the top of my head, but probably about 40 or 50.
Okay.
Somewhere in that.
And what would you say in those countries would be the average number of evangelical believers of any stripe?
Yeah, I mean, if you take that whole region from North Africa to Central Asia, there's approximately 580 million people, and evangelicals are about 0.001% of the population.
Okay, say
0.001%.
So that is 1,000th of 1%.
Yeah.
So you'd have to find, what does that work out to? You'd have to find 1,000 people in order to find one Christian?
Yeah, something like that, yeah.
Wow.
Exactly.
Wow.
But the miraculous things, even with those figures that can in some ways seem so small, but actually in the last 30, 40 years, more Muslims have come to know the Lord in the previous 1400 years. Another thing we're seeing is the country of Iran. Thousands of Muslims are coming to know the Lord in Iran, and Iranians around the world. They're one of the most open people groups now in the Muslim world. And another interesting thing is they did a study out of one of the seminaries in America and found out where there's a rise in radical, especially jihadist Islam, more Muslims are coming to know the Lord in those countries.
Really? Now, you've said quite a few things there that it would be great to unpack. One, you said more Muslims have come to Jesus, and I didn't catch the time frame you said, in the last several years?
Last 30 or 40 years.
Okay, so the last 30 to 40 years, more Muslims have come to faith in Jesus in the last 40 years than the previous 1,400 years combined. Is that what you said?
Yes, that's right.
That's incredible. And especially in Iran and Iraq, you're seeing some fruitfulness and response.
Especially Iran.
Especially
Iran is probably, again, it's Iranians both in Iran, Iranians in the diaspora, whether it's in Asia or America or Europe. They seem to be extremely open, much more open post the Islamic Revolution than before, when Iran was more of a secular nation.
Right. And so these would be principally Persians, correct?
Yeah, I mean, the language they speak is Farsi.
Okay.
Often people assume everyone in the Middle East is Arab.
Right.
But there's Farsi speakers. There's, of course, Turkeys in the Middle East, which are speaks Turkish, and then you have the Arabs as well.
Now, what is it that has, you mentioned that when you've got the rise of radical Islam happening, that you do, concurrent with that, you see greater number of Muslims coming to faith in Jesus Christ. Why is that?
I think it causes people to question their faith. Again, I think Iran is a great example of that. That pre the Iranian Revolution, one could be a Muslim, kind of like a nominal Christian in the West, goes to mosque on occasion. It would identify him or herself as a Muslim, but wasn't something that's real central to their life. And then with the rise of a situation like in Iran, where it kind of forced people to reevaluate their faith.
Okay.
And I also think as people see some of the violence, some of the jihadists, many Muslims themselves are turned off by the violence and what they're seeing, and so it causes them to search. So
you are seeing that what we see on the television that would give us pause to think the whole Middle East has gone completely insane and wants to cut the heads off of all infidels. You're seeing that that's actually not true, that there are many that are responding to their deep spiritual longing to know God.
Sure. I mean, there's approximately 1.6 billion Muslims in the world. And you find the full range in Islam, from those who are jihadist to those who are fundamentalists, but they're not trying to kill anyone. They're just trying to sincerely follow their understanding of God as best as they can. You have folk Muslims who are Muslim in name, but really are much more into folk magical practices, warding off evil, seeking blessings. You have Sufi Muslims who are actually into kind of a mystical Islam, talks more about the love of God. Sometimes they'll go into trances in order to get oneness with God. And you have secular Muslims. So you find the full scope. So you cannot categorize or stereotype any Muslims.
Okay.
And of course, Muslims in North Africa are different from Muslims in Asia. And there are many Muslims that are seeking. One ministry calls them the seekers because so many Muslims are seeking God, crying out to God as best as they can understand and have knowledge of Him. And one of the ways that God is responding to these Muslims who are calling out to him is through dreams and visions. So we're seeing scores and scores of Muslims come to know the Lord through God appearing to them in visions and dreams.
Is that right? Now, have you met some of these yourself that have come to know Christ through dreams and visions?
Yeah, there's been several even through our own works. Just one example, in one of the countries we worked, there was a man who kept on having dreams of Jesus coming and giving him a bowl of soup. And so he thought, this is very strange. Why is the prophet of Christianity coming and giving me a bowl of soup? And this dream happened several times. And one of our churches in one of the countries in the region was actually giving out soup as an outreach. And so right in the middle of these days of having these dreams, his friend said, "Hey, this church down the street is giving out soup." And he went there and we were able to share the gospel with him. So there's many stories like this where God has just appeared to people.
So you're seeing the gospel advance, even though in some of these countries it's illegal to convert. There's, like in Saudi Arabia, there's a death penalty, though rarely, as I understand it, rarely ever actually taken place, but there is a death penalty for converting.
Yeah, I mean, it is very difficult, especially in some of those countries where it's very strict. But yet people are crying out to him. Also, of course, many Muslims travel, even from some of these most oppressive or most strict countries. Mm-hmm. And so as businessmen, many as students, Saudi Arabia is now one of the it's in the top 5 countries of sending international students to the U.S.
So that would be an opportunity for people that live in these university cities and college towns to intentionally reach out to people, whether they're in the U.S. or here in Europe. We have a ton of them studying here in Europe as well. That would be something to intentionally really develop a ministry of.
Sure. And one of the easiest ways for anyone to do that is to invite an international student over for Christmas. Many of the universities, it comes Christmas time and all the students from the nation, of course, all go home to spend holidays with their family. And all these international students, whether they be from China or a Muslim country, are sitting in their dorm rooms eating cold noodles. And it becomes just a very natural way to share the gospel, because if you invite someone over to your house for Christmas, they're curious. They've seen Christmas on TV. They've seen the movies, It's a Wonderful Life or whatever, and so they're curious about how Americans celebrate Christmas. And so to invite a student over to your house for Christmas or Thanksgiving and say, this is why we celebrate Christmas, and this is the meaning behind it. Just to give one example, we were working with one young Muslim man, and we had a Christmas tree, and he said, "I know why you Christians put lights on the Christmas tree." And we said, "Great, Mohammed, we would love to know why we put lights on the Christmas tree." And so he said, you guys put lights on the Christmas tree because Jesus is the light of the world. So I thought, well, not a bad answer. And so it just becomes a non-forced, very easy way to celebrate. It doesn't take a lot of effort on the part of individuals. Just go to the local university and say, I have an extra 2 places at my dinner table at Christmas or Easter, or for Americans or Canadians, Thanksgiving. And just say, do you have any students on your campus that would want to spend the holiday in our house?
And the typical university would help match those up.
Yeah, because because many international students, really come to America or Europe for dual purpose. One of the purposes, of course, to further their education. But the other purpose is they often will come because they're curious about another society, another life. But the sad fact is that I've heard statistics up to 70 or 80% of international students, at least in the U.S., never enter the American home the entire time they're in the U.S.
That's fascinating.
But yet, if you came to their country, they would be inviting you into their home. So there's a desire on their part to get to know Americans. That's why or Europeans. That's why they came to that country to study.
That's fascinating. How did you get involved in all this? Tell me the story about how God called you to reach out to Muslims.
Yeah, just as I was at Bible college, and I had a class on international missions, international evangelism, and praying and seeking about what God would have for me, and just realizing that how few are actually reaching out to Muslims. When I looked at other people groups and other nations and saw how many workers there were to ratio to the population, and then saw that with those working with Muslims was less than 1% of today's missions force. In fact, today's missions force, the vast majority of today's missions force works among people who were already Christians. And very small percentage go to unreached peoples, whether that be Buddhists or Muslims or Hindus. So God kind of used that to kind of stir that desire in my heart.
So you said less than 1% of the current mission force in the Christian church is focused on the unreached people groups of.
Well, it was Muslims at that time.
Okay.
When I think it's gone up a little bit, but it's still the vast majority of Christians are reaching those who are either nominal Christians or working among Christians, doing support ministry of some sort. But the vast, vast majority, both in terms of our resources, our financial resources, and our personnel, most of it goes to where the gospel has already been established. Little goes to the new frontiers.
So you're sitting in college. God starts stirring this stuff in your heart. Then what happened?
Well, then I actually took off a year between my junior year and senior year at college and worked with a ministry that was reaching out to Muslims. One of my professors said that, you take all these gift tests to see which gifts that you have. And he said, well, if you want to really find out if you have the gift of teaching, you teach. And if no one learns, then you probably don't have the gift of teaching.
Yeah.
So I thought I would just take off a year between my junior and senior year at college and just spend that time working with a ministry and to see if this was what really God was calling me to. So that confirmed it. So I did 1 year between my junior and senior year, came back to college, finished my degree, and then actually went out with our denomination to work again immediately after graduating with another working with Muslims. And so God just kind of, by just taking those initial steps, God just kind of confirmed it for me.
And how long have you been doing this now?
Since the early 80s.
So for quite a while. You're getting on up there, chronologically gifted, we would call it, right?
Yeah, that's it.
I have to tease you because we're good friends. Hey, talk to me about the Muslim worldview or the Muslim mindset, because both for myself and for a lot of our listeners, it may be a foreign world to them, and we don't necessarily understand it.
The Muslim worldview. I think that's a good point, because often when we try to talk with someone of another religion or faith, we talk on the belief level. For instance, Muslims say that Jesus isn't the Son of God. Christians say he is, and you can argue back and forth. But there's some basic worldview principles of why they would believe or not believe certain aspects of the Christian faith. So Muslims have their worldview is very strong, of course, around the oneness of God. The word Muslim means one who submits to God, or Islam is submission to God, and so that's a very high priority. Very high priority with most Muslims is the greatness of God. He's omnipotent. He's all-knowing. Again, there's a wide variety of Muslims. Sufi Muslims, of course, would emphasize the love of God, but Orthodox Muslims, not in the same way that we would. Now, some people say that Muslims believe God is cruel or mean. It's not so much that he's cruel or mean, but that he's more distant. It might be you might admire the president of your country, and you might think he's a great ruler, but you don't have the ability just to go in and just walk into his front door and slap him on the back and have a good time with him.
Yeah.
So that would be kind of the more orthodox view of Muslims, is that God is good. He provides for his creation. He provides food and shelter, and he's good. He's gracious. He's merciful. So it's not that he's necessarily cruel, but that there isn't an intimate relationship between human beings. That God is completely other. So they believe that. So we believe that God is great and powerful and transcends, but at the same time, he wants an intimate relationship. And that human beings are created in the image of God. But in Islam, in Orthodox Islam at least, all these would be foreign concepts. God would be totally different. There's a Pakistani woman, she wrote a book back, I think in the 60s or 70s, called I Dare to Call Him Father. And that's what drew her to Jesus, was that God wasn't just, a distant God in heaven, but he was someone who wanted an intimate father-daughter relationship.
Do you find that resonates with them, with the Muslims who see God as a distant, benevolent monarch?
Yeah, so that's one way to begin to talk to Muslims, is to talk about that intimate relationship that we can have with God, and because I think that, again, that's something that's lacking, at least in Orthodox Islam. And another guy, Karl Medeiros, who's worked in that area of the world, written some books. He talks about, instead of trying to argue all the theological differences that we often have with Muslims, is help Muslims fall in love with Jesus. In the Quran, Jesus is mentioned several times. It talks about his miracles, and even his virgin birth has some. But even with all that, there's nothing of the real personality of Jesus in the Quran. How he showed tender and compassion to those who were crippled, those who were outcasts of society, how he treated women different than society. And so often, again, we argue theology, but Jesus spent 2-3 years with his disciples, and they fell in love with him as a person before they fully comprehended his deity and the meaning of his death and all these things. And so I think sometimes we want to rush ahead to those deeper theological issues. Just to take time with a Muslim and share with them stories from the Bible, again, just that highlight the compassion, the love, the wisdom, the caringness of Jesus. And I think as Muslims fall in love with Jesus, then they're eventually more open to understand who he is.
Help me get this. Let's get this down to the street level. So I have some neighbors move in from a different country, and they happen to be Muslim, and I want to build a relationship with them, reach out to them, and hopefully expose them to the gospel of Jesus Christ and see their lives transformed. Walk me through that. What would that look like? Applying these principles and these experiences that you have had, what would that look like? Obviously, I'm not going to show up with Campus Crusade 4 Spiritual Laws book and necessarily
Right. Sure.
try to convert them, but what would I do?
Well, first of all, I mean, just trying to connect with them on a human level.
Mm-hmm.
Often we think, how do I reach a Muslim? How do I reach a Buddhist? But, Muslims are people.
Mm-hmm.
I think of Jesus approaching the woman at the well. The first thing he began with was not that I'm the Son of God. The first thing he began with was water. He's a human being, and he's thirsty, and he needs water. She's a human being. She needs water. So I think the first thing is to find a point of commonality. That could be anything. You both like coin collecting, or you both like working on your cars. I mean, or two women both like to cook and to exchange recipes, just to begin to relate to people on a very human level. And then when it gets to really sharing the word, there's one series called Discover Bible Study. And it's just a very simple approach. It's just sitting down with someone after you built that relationship, and they've shown an interest to maybe know more about the Bible, know more about Jesus, and this Bible issue basically you just sit down with them, start reading through one of the Gospels. I have a friend who does this, and he just asks the Muslim to read the Bible in his own language, just to paraphrase it, what it means to him, and then to just ask some simple questions. What is this saying? If you were to apply what Jesus was teaching in this verse, what would you do this week with it? And the
what's the name of that resource?
I think Discover Bible series.
And I can probably find this online.
Yeah, I believe you could.
Okay,
yeah.
We'll include links in the show notes on this.
Sure. And see that, I think here's an important point. We often think of disciple, that first you convert someone,
mm-hmm.
and then you disciple them. But I think when you look at Jesus and the disciples, and even using something like the Discover Bible Study, that often you begin discipling people the moment you meet them.
Right.
You begin influencing them. And so what he's found with doing these Discovery Bible Studies is that once these Muslims do come to know the Lord, they're better, more advanced disciples than often Christians who've known the Lord for years, because they've already been taught to read the Bible and to see what it says for their lives and to obey it.
That's really good. We have a saying here that we use a lot in Europe, is they have to belong before they believe. In that
right.
we bring them into our community, into our life, and as human beings, simply because we love them, not because we're trying to do something to them, but we're honoring them as human beings, first of all, as image bearers of God. How important is hospitality in reaching out to Muslims?
I mean, yeah, because that is one of the very highest values in many Muslim cultures, whether it be Asian, Arab. It's kind of interesting what is different, at least from the U.S. I'm not sure about Europe as well, is one of the highest honors you can pay a Muslim to show that your friendship is deep is to show up at their house unexpected. Because then they have this opportunity to show you that hospitality. And so, yeah, so being open both to receive and to give hospitality is an amazing way just to begin to share the gospel, to build those relationships.
So you can invite them over, say, hey, come over and join us for dinner, and you'd find out some culturally appropriate meal to serve. You wouldn't want to bring them over for beer and pork chops, but necessarily.
Right, exactly.
They don't typically consume alcohol or eat pork, but you would
right.
want to do something that would be a little bit more, or maybe even involve them in it. I don't know if that would be an appropriate thing to say, hey, let's do a meal together, let's do a barbecue or something.
Sure. I mean, yeah, it is the most natural way. It's more family-centered versus individualistic. inviting entire families. Because I think that's very key too. Is you often, because a Muslim who comes to know the Lord often does receive great rejection from his family. By using hospitality, you can start to influence entire families and not just focus on trying to extract one individual from his context.
That's good. Now, that brings up a point. In reaching Muslims is one of the difficulties that if they convert to Christianity, if they give their life to Christ, not only have they changed their religion, in many cases they've lost their entire social identity, their family, their culture, their society, their ethnic identity. Everything is tied up into being Muslim, correct? Is that correct?
Sure. Yeah, so I think one of the issues that becomes, because they lose all those contexts and all those relationships, is often when they do come to know the Lord, they don't find that same level of relationship within the church. Someone comes to the Lord and we say, here's a Bible, read it every day, pray every day, and I'll see you next Sunday. And then this poor individual who's come to know the Lord, it's his birthday or he graduates from college, and everyone in the church is too busy to notice. But now he no longer has his family to celebrate his birthday with him, or no longer has his family to celebrate that he graduated from university. And so, my challenge I always put forth to the church is, when we begin to reach out to people like this, are we in the church providing a stronger community for them to come into than we're asking them to leave?
That's very good. You're starting to meddle now. You're starting to stir the pot.
I hope so.
Now that we're stirring the pot a little bit, let me be very, very open and honest with you, because I need your help here. I'm having a hard time when I watch the news. You can't seem to go a day without seeing ISIS cutting off the heads of somebody, or kidnapping entire villages, or Boko Haram, doing the terrible things that they're doing, or over in Paris a few weeks ago we had people murdered there by Muslim extremists. It wasn't that long ago in London, the soldier just standing guard in the city of London basically was decapitated right there on the streets. And then a few years ago, you had Theo Van Gogh, one of the descendants of famous painter Van Gogh, murdered right on the streets of Amsterdam, city of tolerance, globally recognized as one of the most tolerant cities in the world. And he's murdered right there in the city. And at times, it's easy for me to find this darkness creeping into my own heart of going, they're all this way. They're all, and you see them and you think, man, are they going to blow up the plane? Are they going to do this? Help me get God's heart for these people. How do I not let all of these things, because it's wrong to just think that everybody that made it onto the news is a representative of that people group. I know that they're not. I really do know that. But boy, I tell you, sometimes I find myself having to fight against that. And I'm sure some other people do as well. I don't think I'm the only one. How would you counsel me, give me advice on catching the heart of God for Muslim people?
Yeah, first of all, of course, you do have to break the stereotypes that the news, of course, portrays.
Yeah.
I just got two different stories in this last couple of weeks. One from Pakistan and one from Africa, where there had been some riots of Muslims, I think, and one involved a church, and Muslims that actually lived near that church came out and stopped the other Muslims from rioting and burning the church. A very similar thing happened recently in Africa, where there was some Muslim riots. They were attacking a hospital run by a church, and the nurses and the doctors, who are mainly Muslims themselves, again, stop the crowds from coming in, destroying the hospital. And so, so many Muslims are as appalled. Some of them don't speak out maybe as loudly as they can because they themselves are afraid.
Right.
Because the reality, when we read all these things, actually far more Muslims are killed by Muslims than Muslims kill Christians.
Correct.
So whether it's Iraq or any of these countries, and so many of the Muslims are afraid of, are as victimized by what's happening as we are in the West, or maybe even more so because many of them are living there.
Yeah, they have to live in the midst of it.
And, I always just think, when it comes to any people group, because we all have our prejudice, whether it's against Muslims or other ethnicities in our own countries and cities. And I think anytime we view people differently than God views people,
right,
one of us is right and one of us is wrong. And I can wager who's right and who's wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's the thing is I keep having to.
And again, going to the woman at the well.
Good. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just saying, going back to the woman at the well, you think of all the prejudice that between Samaritans and Jews at the time.
Yeah.
And just a few years before that, there had been an incident between the Samaritans and the Jews, and when the Samaritans came in and they killed a pig and threw blood all over the Temple Mount, and then the Jews retaliated, and so when Jesus came to the Samaritan woman, she wanted to emphasize the differences versus their common humanity.
Right.
And so, you, a Jewish man, want to talk to me, a Samaritan woman. And so we have to get, when we think about reaching Muslims, reaching Buddhists, that's almost impossible. Hammarskjöld, the previous head of the UN, said, it's more noble to give our life to the one than to love the masses.
Yeah.
And so I think the key is, finding an individual person, whether, I can say, it's easy for me to say I love the Muslim world. It's much different to say I've gotten to know Ahmad personally.
Correct.
Or Khadija personally. And so we tend to stereotype. Mm-hmm. And because in many ways we've kind of been at war in the West between Islam, or just at least, if not Islam in general, but at least between jihadists in the West. And one of the first things that happens in war is that you dehumanize the other side.
Yeah.
Because you cannot kill another human being. And so in World War II, we had derogatory terms to refer to Japanese people, to refer to German people, because I couldn't kill a human being, but if I can dehumanize that Japanese person or dehumanize that German person, then I can kill him.
Yeah.
And I think that's what happens and has been happening probably ever since the 9/11, is both sides have dehumanized the other side. And so to see all people created in the image of God, but again, to get to know individual Muslims or Buddhists or Hindus or whoever God would have us to reach, and to begin to love them, not as a stereotype, but to love the individual person.
Good. That's great advice. Now, Sam, if somebody listening is feeling the stirring of God, the calling of God on their own life, to get involved in reaching Muslims, maybe even become a worker in the harvest field and go to this part of the world, what advice would you give them for their preparation?
Right. My first advice would be to form those relationships in their communities.
In their existing communities.
I mean, yeah. I mean, if you're in Europe, if you're in America, there's probably very little places in anywhere in the West where there's probably not Muslims. And if you can't find Muslims, there's still principles that
Mm-hmm.
begin to reach out to people of other cultures. Now, I work with many people who are called to go overseas, and they'll tell me, "Well, I'm called to go plant a church in such and such nation." And so I'll ask them, "Well, have you ever planted a church in your own nation?" No. You ever led a Bible study in your own nation? No. Have you ever made a cross-cultural relationship? you know, and so the first thing is just to begin where you're at and to begin to build those relationships. Go to find someone at a gas station or go to a local ethnic restaurant and just begin to build relationships.
Mm-hmm.
I and then begin to see training. There's at least in the U.S. there's an organization called Crescent Project that puts together a very easy to read or a nice, I think it's about a 6-episode DVD video. Is one way to train yourself. There's another book called, I think it's called Exploring Islam, which is kind of like the Perspectives course,
Okay.
but on Islam. So there's those type of just abilities to start to learn and to educate yourself, and then to take a scouting trip or visit that area of the world. And then ultimately, we do need workers. Even Foursquare needs workers in that area of the world. So to contact Foursquare missions, tell them of your interest, and then we can begin to see what doors God would possibly open up.
Okay. And we'll include links to these resources as well as foursquaremissions.org to where people can start the process to become a worker in this part of the world. I ask every guest on the podcast this question: if I had a time machine and I was able to send you back many years to the 25-year-old Sam Johnson, what advice would you give that 25-year-old Sam?
Okay, so that was this last year.
Yeah, right. I know that's not true.
Yeah, I think one of the important things is to really to understand where your giftings are and who you are, um, and to allow God to kind of match who you are in the completeness of all He has made you, your personalities, your giftings, and to flow into that, and to be at ease with who God has created you to be. We're each so uniquely mixture of our personalities and our gifts, and just how God has shaped us and who we are, and just to allow God to use you in who you are, not who you are, your expectations of how other people minister or how other people lead, but to just allow God to flow out of who He's created you to be.
Yeah, that's good advice. That's good advice. Well, since we cannot give your contact information out over the public airwaves, what would be a way that people that are wanting to take the next step, what would you say, as far as they're saying, I don't know what I'm supposed to do, I don't know if I need to, if I'm being called, I just need to explore, I need to discover it. Any advice that you would give to them for them to take the next step, or somebody to connect with, something to do to help them in their journey of discovery?
Yeah, as I said, I mean, if you contact Foursquare Missions, we can begin to find ways to, first of all, give training and experiences in the U.S. or even short-term training opportunities overseas. And then if, as you explore that, you feel that it's a long-term calling in your life, we can begin to walk you through that process as well.
So there are ways that they
So,
could get connected within the pipeline and work their way into this part of the world and make a difference to reach these to reach this vast number of people in the harvest field.
Yes, definitely. And the type of people we're looking for are people that are willing to go into pioneer situations. Um, you know, in other areas of the world, there's many opportunities to go be a Bible college teacher or to kind of have a support role. But we're really needing individuals who are willing to go into the new frontiers, to go where there are few or no established churches, to begin to build relationships. People who are willing to make that a long term.
Mm-hmm.
You don't establish a strong work in that area of the world in a 6 months jaunt.
Right.
It takes a commitment.
What would that worker look like?
This is often a challenge today.
Yeah. So that worker would be somebody that's willing to do hard work, fight the good fight, be in it for the long term, and learn the language, knowing going into it that they are plowing up a hard place, but knowing that God is faithful, that His word is not bound. That's the kind of person you need.
Yes, and a person who's just, I think one of the hardest things of working in that world, in that area of the world, is we want to write great newsletters that 600 people came to know the Lord last week, and I preached this mighty sermon, and 50 people got slain in the Spirit, and
yeah.
But what it is going into a community, being incarnational in that community, sitting down with people, having cups of tea and coffee, as we talked about before, inviting people over to your house, building relationships. That doesn't always make a great newsletter that I went to 6 homes and drank 30 cups of tea today.
Yeah.
But in this area of the world, that's what it's going to take.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the cultural context. That's the missionary context that we have to look at of, the way that we incarnationally embrace the advance of the gospel. Well, Sam, are there any other words of wisdom and advice or things that you'd like to share with our community that's listening to this podcast?
Yeah, I think one other key that I found that has worked working with Muslims is so simple. It's just, as you're talking with your Muslim friend, and they share something that's happening in their life. They lost their job, their mother's sick, and just to offer to pray for them. And not the normal Christian way where at church where we say we're going to pray for someone and then go home and forget about it. But just to, right there, just say, do you mind if I pray for your mother? I pray that you will find a job. And then I've yet to find a Muslim who's told me, no, don't pray.
Really?
And so I will just pray a simple prayer. I'll pray in the name of Jesus. Matter of fact, I was working with one ministry, and one day one of the people that we were working with came to us and said, I'm really mad at you guys. We said, why? He said, well, you're always praying for Muhammad, and God's answering all his prayers. Why do you pray for him more than you pray for me? And so it just has to be a very simple prayer. God, my friend here, Ahmad, has lost his job, and would you please provide a job for him? And as Muslims begin seeing God answering your prayers and the heart and the way you pray and the way you address God, it can be a powerful witness to them.
That's amazing.
I think we make sharing our faith so difficult versus just keeping it in the context of relationship and prayer.
So my takeaways from this talk with you, Sam, is I need to treat people like they're human.
Right.
See them as the image bearer of God. These, Muslims are God-oriented people. Their hearts are open. They are. I love that phrase you use. They are the seekers. They are seeking for God. Then we build relationship with them. Just getting to know them. We're not trying to do the religious Jesus thing to them, but we're just, having coffee. We're having tea. We're inviting them for a meal. Getting to know one another. Letting the Word of God do its work by the stories of Jesus. They're not opposed to listening to the stories of Jesus. In fact, the God that we love and adore and we serve is attractive to many of them because he is not only this great and powerful God, he is also our Father. And that
Exactly.
they're open to us expressing this love and this faith. And when we pray for them and God intervenes, then they see the reality of our faith. You've made it sound like it's actually not rocket science or brain surgery to bear witness to Jesus in a Muslim context.
Right. And again, I think I think we witness out of who we are. We minister out of who we are. If you've had a problem with depression, and then God reached into your life and freed you from depression, well, there's probably a Muslim around you who's struggling with depression. And so out of the very thing that God has done to you is the way you reach out to others.
That's good.
God salvaged your marriage, and there's a Muslim neighbor who's having trouble in their marriage. Paul said he ministered out of his weaknesses.
Yeah.
Just minister out of how God touched you.
That's really good. That's good advice. Well, Sam, thank you so much for being with us on the podcast today. It's been a real joy.
All right. Appreciate it. Thanks.
And I'd like to remind all of you that are listening, both Sam and I are among more than 24 missionaries supported by the Foursquare Missions Global Missions Fund. This is your missions money at work. Thank you for your support, for sponsoring us and allowing us to be able to take the good news of Jesus to the ends of the earth.
Well, we're done now. Thanks for listening. This is Jeff Roper reminding you that the mission of God is too grand for mediocrity or average living. You were created for a purpose, and that purpose is found in the mission of God. It's your life. Now go live it.